I took an independent investigation that we commissioned from a big law firm to go into to research why our police and the Virginia State Police did not intervene in the street fighting and the conflicts that happened between the protesters and the counter-protesters. But when all was said and done, you had open street fighting and you had an unlawful assembly declared very quickly, and then you had street fighting happen after that, and the images of seeing assaults happen all over the streets, including this horrific beating of a African-American youth in a parking garage. And then you had a car used as a weapon in kind of the ultimate coda to all this, which was a terrorist attack, where Heather Heyer was killed and 19 other people were injured.
And I think it's important, first of all, to honor Heather Heyer's memory, but it's also important to honor all of the other people who were in danger, because, as you say, this was splintered street fighting.
Right.
The car was a horrendous sort of apex to the situation, but there was street fighting all over. Let's come back to this theme of leadership. Leadership is everywhere in the news. There are an incredible number of books by well-known authors out there. Doris Kearns Goodwin, the famous presidential biographer, has come out with a book on leadership. Stanley McChrystal has come out with a really fascinating book on leadership, and incidentally, the first chapter of which is dedicated to Robert E. Lee, and talks about the fact that you can have great leaders who lead on the basis of deficient moral premises, and you can have poor leaders who lead on the basis of very powerful moral premises. Before we get to your leadership, how do you assess the leadership of these alt-right groups, of the Unite the Right, for example? Is this about one person? Is this a splintered movement, with a leaderless movement like Occupy? What is your assessment of the leadership?
I think it's a great question. I think it's generally a leaderless movement that's cellular. I think that it bears all of the weaknesses of those sorts of organizations, which is they have a very hard time translating what they want into action that an entity will give them. So that the Occupy movement had a very tough time translating what they wanted into action by government. The Tea Party movement had just as hard of a time, and I'm very critical of them because you see their focus on the debt limit or fiscal responsibility disappear just into the ether recently when you have this massive expansion of the deficit. So it's very, with these groups that are really movements, that are, and you see in the alt-right, they have, you saw in Charlottesville, there were over a dozen of these groups that came with very different causes. Some of them thought that they were here to protest immigration in Europe. And the fracas about the Lee statue somehow became a window into that.
So there's a lack of a unified purpose, let alone a unified message.
And then my view is that the traditional leaders that you do have within this movement are extremely poor and self-destructive, and they are also faced with the uphill battle of, if they have anti-democratic ideas like Richard Spencer or some of these other, like Chris Cantwell or some of these other figures in the movement, they are faced with a system that has been reinvigorated on constitutional principles and is doing everything it can to oppose them, and they are not being successful. So you see, to me, the most extraordinary one of them out of the Unite the Right event was by revealing to the nation how violent they are, and by actually killing somebody, and by actually engaging in terrorism, and then by hurting so many other people, and by having that all on full view. It was the greatest self-inflicted injury they could have done in a constitutional republic that already had been invigorated and awake to these dangers by dealing with 8 months of President Donald Trump, I believe. So the evidence for that is that in the Virginia elections that happened several months later, you had a massive surge of progressive voters show up to reject a candidate who campaigned on Confederate imagery.
Right. Well, and I think to the extent that social media is a tool for a lot of this, a tool for getting attention focused on oneself, a tool for getting to places and getting to power that one would not otherwise have. It's clearly, as you're saying, it's backfired. But they also had a stage
but not backfired without cost. So I think that's important, is that you know, I think virtually
great point.
everything about this era that we're in evades easy categorization, because there's a velocity to these events and there's a overlapping nature to them that means that we have to be simultaneously in the fight and you know, even the way that social media has compressed the news cycle for leaders and how much the feedback loop has tightened. So you're dealing with a lot of the time some issue that literally is produced by somebody live tweeting or live feeding something that just happened. So the reporter or the constituent groups are dealing with this, and that can create lots of chaos when there are bad facts in that, or when there's.
So the social media is part of the problem. It's
a huge part of the problem. I think that it is done far much ill than it has good in terms of our causes as a constitutional republic trying to help people and produce good governance.